Day 519. So today, if you've been following what we've been doing, is changing a little bit up from underwriting a deal every single day to covering topics that I want to learn how to explain simply to my daughter, my family, because after interviewing folks for 3 years, I wish I had somebody just sit me down, just walk me through some of this jargon that gets thrown around a lot of time in real estate. So today, we're going to be talking about real estate disclosures. It's these important details about a home that a seller and the agent and a buyer they should all be sharing with one another, right? Typically, if you're listing a home, you have to understand what are the must know items, what's required by law, and how it protects everyone involved in the transaction. So we're trying to use some analogies. We try to keep it simple, and this is going to be really fun. Okay, so let's talk about number one, why disclosures matter, right? Imagine you're this is so good because I've been looking at Pokemon cards lately because they're making like a big resurgence. Imagine you're trading cards and one of your cards is bent or it's missing a corner or there's a wrinkle on it. Especially if you're online and the killer can't see it, right? It's only fair that you let somebody know about that condition or the issue with that Pokemon card if they're trading you something valuable, especially if you're giving them money or a chore or services. And that's essentially what a real estate disclosure does, right? It makes sure nobody feels blindsided and taken aback by hidden problems. So disclosing important issues, it's not just the polite thing, but for real estate, it's also the law. If you fail to mention that the roof is broken or leaking, right, significant detail about a property, that could mean a lawsuit, just very expensive problems later. Okay. So today, let's talk about the 5 types of disclosures. Okay. It's a long list, but I want to highlight some of the top ones. I'll probably talk about 5. The first one is the transfer statement disclosure. And the transfer statement is a this is a form where the sellers detail any known faults or conditions about the home. So if the water heater is broken, you got to disclose that because that's a big capital investment. If the roof is leaking, right, which might signal that you need to replace the roof, big deal. If there are termite issues, probably need to disclose that as well, right? Especially if you know about it. And it's required because the laws will say that a seller must be transparent about anything that can lower the home's value or cause any sort of safety concerns, right? So I think of this as a sort of like a checklist or a condition checklist where if you're selling a video game console and there's a button that sticks, right? You want the new owner to know, like, hey, this button on a controller is sticky, right? It doesn't really respond because otherwise they might not be happy with a purchase. Something that's very important. All right. Second disclosure is the natural hazard notice. And this is a notice about whether a house is a region that's prone to earthquakes, floods, fires, especially if you're in a brush fire or wildfire zone, or any other environmental risk, right? If you're in Florida, subject to wind damage on your roof from hurricanes, it's all required because they need to know that they're moving somewhere that might require special insurance. Because some insurance policies, let's say California, some insurance companies will give you an insurance policy, but they might say, hey, this does not cover fire. Some insurance companies will give you an insurance policy, but it says it does not cover any damages from a flood, right? And as you know, sometimes when you buy a property in a hurricane prone area, a lot of the damage caused by a storm surge, which is the flooding. All right. So let's say you have a tree house and it's super windy in the backyard, right? Especially when you're high up there. I mean, you should probably tell someone, hey, before you go up there, it's gonna get pretty windy. This is the same thing, right? You gotta tell people and warn them of the potential danger before they step into a situation like that. Third disclosure, it's called the lead based paint hazard disclosure. And this is typically for older homes, and that was before a certain year. And if the home was built in an area where certain paint contained lead, I mean, the sellers must mention that. You got to tell the buyer that, especially if there's any sign of that old paint, because this can be very harmful, especially to kids. So this is very, very important. Tons of disclosures about this. Okay. And I like to think of this as, hey, you ever picked up like a candy wrapper and it says like, hey, the wrapper says like, hey, might contain peanuts. And that you have to say that because there are very severe peanut allergies. So if you don't tell them that there are peanut allergies or allergens in the food, I mean, you might cause someone to have a severe allergic and potentially deadly reaction. Again, that's the analogy I want to use for why these disclosures matter. Then the fourth disclosure is general reports about the neighborhood, right? Some places might require that the buyer know where to find information about the local neighborhood conditions, whether there might be a development. I mean, if you think it might affect someone's decision to buy that property, it can't hurt to disclose. Okay. And you just want to make sure that everybody has access to the public data that might affect their comfort area, especially if they're living there in that neighborhood in that area. All right. Next thing, environmental concerns, the fifth one. And this could be inclusive, like notices on like possible mold, radon gas, contamination nearby, maybe next to a gas station. All these factors matter. And these health hazards, sometimes people don't, you can't see some of the stuff right away with the naked eye, right? Asbestos, sometimes you gotta get tested for that stuff. If you know it's there, you gotta disclose it. Okay. All right. So let's say, I mean, what's a good analogy? Let's say you have a fish tank and you think the fish tank might be dirty, right? But before you let someone take that fish tank from you and put fish in it before cleaning it, I mean, you got to tell them like, hey, look, that fish tank is pretty dirty. There's some I tested before the pH level is all off. You got to figure out what happens. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is now that we covered the five different disclosures, I want to talk about like the why are these disclosures required? Sometimes there's federal rules. Let's start the highest level. Federal rules, the lead paint one, that comes from national regulations trying to protect public health. So you got to follow this. You got to disclose it as a seller, even if the buyer doesn't ask about it. Then there's state requirements. Every state is different, but some areas might require that, hey, you got to fill out a special form, especially if the property is in a floodplain or near a fault line, especially in an earthquake area. And you can't break these rules. You break these rules, they're going to lead to fines, lawsuits. It's just not worth it. Why would you hide something? All right. And then finally, there are what we call buyer's right to know. And a lot of laws, they want to give a buyer enough details to make an informed decision. And agents will gather all these forms, make sure the buyer receives them on time before they make the purchase, especially if they're closing on a property. Okay. So let's talk about what's permissible and not. What's permissible is I mean, obviously it's very common sense, right? You got to provide all the known information about the property's condition. You got to point the buyer to any official resources, especially if you're talking about crime statistics. And just think about the guiding principle. Just be honest, be clear in all your communications. And we talked a little bit earlier, but you cannot, it is absolutely not permissible for you to hide or minimize any crucial information, especially if there's structural problems, there's known hazards like lead. And please don't falsify reports. Don't say you never had water damage when you did. If you just had a little leak in the roof, that counts as water damage. You got to disclose it. All right. So don't downplay it. All right. Just own it. It's part of the house. There's no need to lie about it. All right. So let me look up what was the top search question about disclosures. Okay, one of the top search question was what happens if a seller doesn't disclose something big when it comes to selling their home? There's legal action that the buyer can take, right? The buyer can back out of the contract or even sue if they find out later. Then there's repair costs, right? The seller could end up paying for the repairs or reimbursing the buyer for those repairs if they did not disclose it. And finally, I mean, huge reputational issue. Like if you're an agent and you're a seller and you hit a problem, you're putting your license at risk, right? And then finally, are there what's the other top question on my notes? Are there situations where you don't have to disclose? So sometimes people might say, "Hey, we're selling this house as is. It's an as is sale." Right? Even if the home is sold as is, if you know major defects, you still have to review them. You can't just claim ignorance for something that you know is there. If you know it's there, you have to sell it, even though you're selling it as is. Then there are bank owned or foreclosure sales where a bank has taken over possession of a property because someone did not pay the payments on the debt, did not service the debt on it with monthly payments. Well, a bank might foreclose that property, and a bank might not have as much information about the property, but there's still certain information that is still required by the law. So you got to look at your legal regulations. And finally, if you have an inherited property, if you honestly don't know those issues because you never lived there, like you inherit the property from a grandparent or parents, I mean, you should disclose what you know. But again, ignorance as a guiding principle is not an excuse if there's a known major defect. All right. So let's what's a good analogy? Let's say you're selling a used comic book, right? You're trading it and you're selling somebody, and it has water damage, right? Even though you're not promising perfection, you should still say, "Hey, this corner got wet at some point." Like, it's just a good thing to do. It's just a good guiding principle. So all this matters because you got to understand, for someone buying a real estate transaction, it's a huge investment. So you got to ensure transparency to protect both the buyer and the seller, and making sure that everybody's feels fair. It needs to be a fair transaction. If you're upfront, that builds trust. It avoids any nasty surprises. It just keeps the whole transaction feeling smooth, clean, especially in the eyes of the law, in case if anything ever happens and you end up in the court. All right. So that's what I wanted to cover for disclosures today. You probably understand in general what they are. Disclosures is a pretty straightforward term, but knowing, understanding like some of the key disclosures that need to happen in a transaction, that's really important. And as a guiding principle, especially for my daughter that's probably going to buy a home someday, you should know what's fair and you should have the guiding principle that, hey, if you're selling a home, you should disclose whatever you knew about that home. All right. I hope you all have an amazing Saturday. Spend some quality time with your family and friends today, because that's what life is all about. And if you have any good examples or analogies about disclosures that you would like to include, leave the comment down below. And I'll be back here tomorrow for day 520. We're going to keep this going. And if you guys ever want, please join our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@Kent_HE, and subscribe. And if you guys want to join our email list, you can go to affordablehousing.io, join our email list right there, and you can stay up to date on all our content updates. Hey, I appreciate you all so much. Thank you so much for supporting the Affordable Housing Podcast. Without people like you, I would have never had the home I grew up in. So I appreciate you all giving me the time today and just listening. Thank you. Appreciate it. See you tomorrow. Have a good one, everybody.